thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I really enjoyed Jenny's talk as well. So we will be talking about overcoming the arrival fallacy and finding meaning in everyday life. For those of you who like to have a roadmap of where we're going, we'll talk about the arrival fallacy trap and what it means and a little bit of the brain science actually behind it, all the way leading up to some strategies that you can apply when you're looking for your Ikigai. So let me ask if this sounds familiar to anybody. Has anybody worked toward a large goal, achieved the goal, and then felt this tremendous letdown? You might have even said this cannot be all that it was cracked up to be. You might have said, I changed my mind about this. I don't even want to do this anymore. Or what's next? We refer to that really as the arrival fallacy, which means it's that belief that when you arrive at a certain destination, you'll finally be happier. I see this play out a lot in veterinary medicine, and it may even start as early as, as long as I just get into vet school, I'll be happy. Well, and then I get into vet school, but somehow I'm not happy. So it's probably just once I graduate, I'll be fine. And then I graduate, but life still doesn't feel really good. So maybe it's about getting an internship or a residency or gosh, it's not then either. So maybe it's about the next job, or maybe it's not about those jobs. Maybe it's about buying a house. And so a cue that you might be experiencing this arrival fallacy is that you constantly are telling yourself, I'll be happy when I lose weight, when I get that next job, when I get into a partnership. And so the thing I like to tell people is that happiness is really an inside job. It will rarely come from the goals that we set for ourselves, although that can be a component of our happiness. And it's important to know that wherever we go, there we are. So whatever we have that we maybe have not dealt with or issues in our life, they are not going to be resolved because we somehow magically arrive at a destination. And there's some important brain science behind the arrival fallacy. So I'm going to talk in neuroscience terms just very briefly, bear with me. There's something in the brain that's known as the reward circuit. And the most important reward pathway in the brain is the mesolimbic dopamine system, which runs really from the ventral tegmental area up to the nucleus accumbens. And it's a key detector of rewarding stimulus. So in simple terms, activation of this pathway tells the individual to repeat what you just did to get your reward. And it also tells our memory centers to pay particular attention to all the features of that rewarding experience so that we can repeat it, which makes sense. Not surprisingly, it's a very old pathway from an evolutionary point of view. In studies in rats, how this is played out is they implanted electrodes in rats, and the rat then had the opportunity to press a lever where they would then receive a stimulus in this reward circuit. And what they found was when the rat was given the option to intentionally trigger this reward circuit, they would do that at all expense. So they would bypass food, they would bypass sex, they would bypass feeding their young, they would even walk over electrical shock system grid so that they could intentionally continue to trigger this lever. So at some point, unfortunately, this system can almost go into overdrive and overdrive then our common sense. How that plays out then is that this arrival fallacy operates according to the premise that as we work toward a goal, we expect to reach the goal. We also experience some satisfaction in that process. But our brain adjusts to that process so that by the time we actually reach the goal, it is far less exciting than we thought it would be. And so we can experience that emotional letdown. For most of us, what do we do then? Instead of being curious about that, we want to immediately go back like the rat with the lever and trigger that reward center again. So many people have had the experience of we reach a big goal, we thought it was all we wanted. People might even tell us congratulations for it. We'll minimize that because we've already set up our next goal. And then our brain kind of gets that charge again of excitement about getting to work toward the next goal. So a component that I want to talk about, this Ikigai, which is a Japanese term, really has us take a step back and look at really what brings us joy and meaning. So the word itself comes from two Japanese words, iki, which is life, and gai, which is value or worth. And so it really means, what's that reason for being? Or what is that thing that gets you out of bed every day? Dan Buettner did a study. He's a longevity researcher, and so he has studied pockets in the world that he calls blue zones, where folks live to be over 100. And one of the areas that he specifically studied was in Okinawa, where they have 5 times the people who pass the 100-year mark as they do in the United States. Part of the research was that he asked the people, what gets you up in the morning? And he said what was interesting about this group and many of the other groups that he studied of folks over 100 is that they instantly knew what got them up in the morning, as opposed to other cultures, and he specifically referenced the United States. He said when he'd ask folks in the United States what gets you up in the morning, he said often he'd get a very either no answer because the person didn't know, or he'd get a very sarcastic answer like, well, I wish I didn't have to bother getting up because life's a chore, or more of just an obligation. Well, I have to get up to feed my kids. And so he said many people focus more on the burden of what they have to do versus the privilege of getting up and having the opportunity to connect with society. So in his research, he concluded that Ikigai, finding that reason for getting up, plays a profound role in longevity, and that there really is something about rising each day with a purpose and a clarity that does your body and your mind good. So what is Ikigai not? Ikigai is not a goal with an end date. It's not one of those things you work hard for and then finally succeed at or just give up and then move on. It's actually something you can do every single day with what you have on hand. One of the Okinawans that Buettner studied was an individual who said his reason for getting up every day was the honor to catch fish to feed his grandchildren. So it wasn't anything grandiose. Again, Ikigai then is not this dream or a passion. It's not this thing that's always out there that you never quite get to achieve. It's actually very personal. So another person's Ikigai might be getting to hold doors open for people, just having that chance to interact with somebody in a generous way. It doesn't cost any money. It doesn't require any great planning, but it's meaningful for the person doing it and for the person receiving it. Ikigai is also not something that drains you. In fact, it actually restores or recharges your battery every day. It's enjoyable, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. So another example that was given was a person who likes to paint houses, which can be very physically demanding. You can be in hot conditions. You can be up on a ladder. But there's some joy that they receive from getting to start working with a house that needs to be scraped and primed, getting to watch your work take place in real time, and then getting to see the joy of the person who comes home and sees their painted house. Ikigai is also not invisible. So an example would be, let's say you really like art. Going to the art museum and simply looking at art is not your Ikigai. Or if you dream about having a restaurant, just the dreaming about having the restaurant is not your Ikigai. But cooking every day might be. So it's an actual action or activity with an effect that others can see. It's also not complicated. A good way to find out if you're narrowing down your Ikigai is, can you say it in a single sentence? Because if it's not, then it may be more of a philosophy or a theory or an approach versus just your fundamental reason for getting up every day. So it could be something simple. Again, referring back to the Okinawan, he said, I fish every day to provide sustenance for my granddaughters. That's it. It's also not something you just do for yourself. The whole concept is really that it connects you with others in a meaningful way. And so it's something that you can share. What's interesting is if you look for descriptions of Ikigai on the internet, and some of you have maybe even gone to workshops where you'll see this concept, you'll see something that looks very much like the model on the left. This is frequently shown as the representation of Ikigai, and it's close, but it doesn't really quite capture what the Japanese are aiming for. In this westernized model, we ask, what do you love? What are you good at? What does the world need from you? But we also have added in, what can you be paid for? And what's interesting is that in study after study of those who really connect to their Ikigai, it very rarely has anything to do with money. It could, so that's not a downside. That might be a bonus, but it's not based on that. In a more recent survey of Japanese men and women, just 31% of those participants cited work as a component of their Ikigai. So it may have something to do with income. Very often it actually won't. It really does, however, have to do with a sense of oneness to a group. And we'll talk about it more in a moment, but this process of feeling in flow, like you almost lose sense of time. You're so invested in what you're doing, this Ikigai, that you almost lose track of what else might be going on around you. So one component of that I found helpful for me is I attended a workshop called Corporate Athlete Training through Johnson & Johnson. I thought it was a wonderful training if anybody else has a chance to do it. And one of the many exercises that they had us do was look at our values. And so in this middle column, we had the value of work, family, health, friends, community that we were to look at. And in the left column, you can see where I ranked, where I thought these values were in my life, with the 1 representing I had complete disengagement of that value, and a 7 would be that I felt that I was fully engaged. So what I said I valued most were family and health. Just behind that, I said that I valued work. Unfortunately, a little below that were my friends, and even lower than that were community. That's what I said I valued. When I actually looked at my concrete behaviors and where I actually spent my time and energy, there was no contest. Work won every single time. Sometimes out of necessity, because I worked in clinical practice and had emergencies. So sometimes that was the case, but it truly also became more of a habit for me. So I would be the person who was taking calls and answering emails on a holiday, on the weekend, on vacations. If it came down to choosing between work or family and health, I always trumped that with work. And that was my responsibility. And in part was just losing connection with, okay, what really matters to me, and where do I most want to spend my time? And so some ways to get to that are that there are 3 essential questions you can begin to ask yourself on discovering what's my real purpose. What is it that I want to do when I'm here? The first one would be, what do you love and value? And I always indicate to people, really pay attention to your energy. So the analogy I like to use is, if you think about your day starting off with a jar of pennies, those pennies really indicate units of energy. And almost everything we do is going to take a penny out of that jar. If it's getting up in the morning, if it's getting dressed, if it's preparing, breakfast for your family, or walking your dog, getting to work. Most things that we do are going to take some energy away. Often we can do some things that can put some pennies back. But I find that in the very giving profession, such as veterinary medicine, we're much better givers than we are receivers. And so it's not unusual for us to have no pennies, maybe halfway through the day, with really nothing left to spare. So when we think about this initial question to discover what's our real purpose, some things that you can ask yourself are, how do you feel when you're doing certain actions? You may be doing certain actions out of habit or because you feel obligated to, but upon reflection, you may find that they actually drain you and you don't like doing them at all. And so that might be an opportunity to course correct. The things that you're doing, are they natural for you, or are you trying to imitate somebody else or adhere to some standard that you think somebody else might have set for you? What kind of activities drain you? What kind of activities fill you up? What work would you do if you weren't paid to do it? And then again, what is it that you truly love? The next question you can ask is, what am I good at? We all have unique talents and gifts. It's interesting, though, that oftentimes if somebody says, what are you really good at, we're kind of stumped. Maybe it's because we've been taught it's not good to brag about yourself. But I think often in our culture, it's very common to think about what we don't do well. And we can make a list of all the things that we need to work on. And we make New Year's resolutions of all the things that we somehow need to do better. And we don't spend a tremendous amount of time focusing on what we really do well. I've highlighted some books here, and one of the ones that I highly recommend are any of the strengths-based books. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this strength system, if you happen to get one of these books, that'll come with a code that you can go online and take an assessment. And generally it's about a 177 item assessment, but don't let that overwhelm you because it actually goes by pretty fast. It's looking at 34 talents. And as a question comes up, the question will come up in a pairing. So it might show you on one side, I read instructions carefully. And then the other side might say, I like to jump right into things. And you'll have 20 seconds to click on which of those answers most fits you, even if it's not a perfect fit. And at the end of that, you'll have access to a pretty full report, and it will list the 5 things that you are really good at. And often, again, we're not even aware of these because these skills come so naturally to us that we tend to take them for granted. So for example, when I took the strength-based leadership test, my top strength came up as strategic. And it describes that skill as something that cannot really be taught, so it's not like something I went to school to learn. It was really just a natural ability I had to see patterns and themes and pictures, and to make kind of sense of the world by looking at those themes. So that's something that I can naturally offer without having to spend a lot of time or energy on it. And then obviously when I work in teams, other people bring different strengths to the table to balance that out. So some ways to also look about that if you're reflecting are, what have you been yearning for? What do you desire intensely to do? What do you do well that you may not even remember learning? And then what are your strengths? The third question in this process is, what does the world need? And again, it may not be anything grandiose. It doesn't necessarily have to tie to formal education. Often, all of us have had life experiences and lessons that we've learned along the way. And it can be often amazing that when we reflect on those lessons and how they may have altered the course of our life, that's really what other people want to hear from us. Jenny mentioned that when she talked about the vulnerability and courage, that it's often about sharing those stories that really make a greater impact on the world. And not necessarily the accolades we've received academically or in the work world. So thinking through what are those things, again, that you can offer people that are just genuinely of you, not necessarily something that you physically do for somebody, but a way you are of interacting with them. One example I can give you from my life is ties into getting into flow, which I mentioned previously. And another way we might think of that is when you get really in the zone. You just get so locked into that activity, you're enjoying it, that you're not worrying about what you need to do 5 minutes from now, and you almost lose sense of time. So oddly enough, my way of getting into flow is organizing and cleaning. I love to do it. I love to declutter. I love to sort, and I love to rearrange furniture. No, I don't get paid for it, and probably if I did, I wouldn't like it as much because then I might feel obligated to do it. But that's the activity for me that I really just feel in sync. And it's also my Ikigai because it's a thing that I can genuinely give to friends. That's a way of connecting with them, that's contributing to the world in a way that's very genuine to me. I have friends who may be going through a stressful time, or friends who may have a sick child or sick partner, and they just feel overwhelmed by the stuff in their space. And so they know I'm the one. If you want some help going through a closet or organizing a kitchen, I'd love to be there. And we can make it fun, and we can make it interactive, and we can put some music on. So it's a simple thing. It doesn't cost anything. It takes a little bit of my time. But it's a way of genuinely giving to other people in a way that makes a difference. So how do you go about finding your Ikigai? Well, you can reflect on some of the lessons that we learned today. Sometimes it's just about stopping for a minute instead of going and doing all the time. Just asking yourself, like, how many pennies do I have left in my jar? And how many pennies is this activity taking? Really tune into when you feel most in flow. And those times actually may surprise you. It may not be what you're thinking right now. I also encourage that folks set a regular time to journal. And it's ideally, from a neuroscience standpoint, it's much better if you handwrite versus you type. One, it slows your thinking down, so you really have to process the information, helps you be more mindful to it and connected to it. You can also use the 3 questions that we discussed here as a guide. So what do I love? What do I value? What does the world need? What is that reason that I want to get out of bed every day? And understand that if you don't have the answer today, that's perfectly okay. For many people, it's really a process of discovering and rediscovering. And also know that just because you know what it is today, it may change tomorrow as your interests and your abilities change. And it's also okay to have more than one. So really taking time to reflect on what brings you meaning in a way that connects you to others. And that's it.